Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Thanks a lot, Priyank, for providing me the opportunity to talk about Flutter and how it became a strategic point at the company where I work at. And many thanks to Vallish for really coordinating this event and guiding me through the various crooks and crannies when it comes to the logistics of it. Today, I will be talking about what Funda has been doing for the last year. I'll be talking about Flutter. For those of you who are not very familiar with Flutter, Flutter is a cross-platform development tool invented at Google Labs and which enables you to build applications for web, iOS, and Android with a single source code. It's quite an interesting story from Funda's point of view, because we really had to explore what Flutter means to us as a company, and if it could actually help us solve some very specific organizational problems. As Priyank already mentioned, I'll be going through the slides. My presentation is broadly split up into the why, the what and how bit, and what's next. And at the end of every major section, I will check in with you, Priyank, and maybe we can do some Q&As during that bit so that we don't have questions all the way moved to the end of the session. So let's try to keep it interactive. Yes, so validating Flutter at scale. A little bit about myself. Yes, in this picture I have hair. Right now I don't. In this picture I have a beard. I don't now. I don't have glasses, but here I do. Yet it's me. I am a platform engineer at Mobile. What does that exactly mean? It means that I look at issues that are broader than user features for the company I work at and address platform-wide decisions that are made when it comes to authorization and authentication or user consent management or analytics as some of the examples. And I like to look at what it means for the mobile apps and how to standardize the process of bringing that into effect for the mobile apps we have. I have about 7+ years of professional, which means getting paid while doing it, experience with mobile apps. But before that, I was introduced to mobile apps after my first job, which I worked for a year at Hewlett-Packard after my engineering. And that's when I was a research associate at Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur. And we were building a prototype on J2ME devices. And that's also when it really caught my attention and my intrigue on really old mobile phones, really primitive mobile stack, and the challenges that come with designing UI components and working with limited resources. And ever since then, I have been attached to mobile app development. I'm also quite happy to say that I was one of the early adopters of Android. I started playing around with it pretty much from the time of Gingerbread. And I'm also experiencing something very similar with Flutter now. I think I'm also part of the early adopters here, and it's just as exciting. So I see myself as someone who is constantly looking at new technologies, new ways of solving solutions, new approaches to solving solutions, and I try to force myself and keep myself busy by learning new technologies. It's that bit which gives me a lot of energy at my work. So today we are here to talk about Flutter and what it means for Funda, but maybe before that, let's have a short introduction about Funda. What is Funda? Funda is the #1 online real estate marketplace in the Netherlands. We have about 95% of the listings of houses in Netherlands are on our platform. From an organizational point of view, Funda sits between what we call the Zooker. I took permission of Valish and Priyank on this, and they allowed me to have one slide with Dutch words in it because we thought it could be fun. So to the left, you see the illustration of a woman on a bicycle checking a push notification on her device. We call that whole segment as the Zooker. In English, that would mean someone, an active searcher, someone who is searching for a house. So you can think of yourself. You want to move into a new house, you want to buy a new house, or you want to sell your existing house and move to another house in Bangalore. And you would typically go to housing or similar platforms, 99 acres, and that's the bit of the customer, which is the Zooker. Makelaar, as it's called, which is this guy to the right on a scooter, and it's quite common that real estate agents go around the city in the scooter. The Netherlands is the guy who is indeed the real estate agent, the broker. And Funda is at the heart of it. And we take comment from people who, we take content, which is from the real estate agents, publish it on our platform. But we also look at the users and try to understand what exactly are they searching and help them along the process to really find their dream house. So we are the #1 online real estate platform. We have about 45 million visits per month on the website. We are in the top 5 websites in the Netherlands across all domains or across all areas of interest. We have about 26 million visits on the mobile apps alone per month. So yeah, the change fail rate needs to be low, as you can imagine, and the lead time needs to be low if you were to think about the DASA metrics. So there is inherently a very high demand from the users to attain a very high quality standard for the mobile apps as well as the website. And outage costs us a lot of money, and it also costs us a lot of PR, bad PR or negative PR on the media. It's a very sensitive platform. It's not a platform where you buy shoes, but you buy houses. So people who generally are on our platform are quite serious and are making a very important decision in their life. So we have to make sure that we ensure the best quality for the consumers. And that takes me to kind of the customer and what it means for Funda. At Funda, customer is at the heart of every decision making. Even if it comes to, do we want to use Solar Cloud or move to Elastic, or do we want to use Segment as a DMP, or do we want to stick with Google Analytics? You might feel that maybe this doesn't mean much to the customers, but it does. And a customer doesn't have to know the technology we use, but everything we do it to help our customers. And the customers are broadly 2 types of customers, as I discussed. One being the person who is searching, and the other being the real estate agent. There are our entire organization is split up into teams which cater into the various bits of the customer journey that a customer is. It all starts with orientation, when you try to get an understanding of, okay, I want to live in Bangalore, but where? Which neighborhood do I want to live in Bangalore? What would be the most convenient? I'm taking Bangalore as an example because it's a city that is very close to me. Where would I live in Bangalore and what neighborhood suits me considering where my office is? So that's kind of the orientation bit. And that's when Funda is introduced to the people, and we have an entire team which is dedicated to provide enabling users to search the right location, the right house. And that once you have decided upon a house or a list of houses, then you plan a viewing. Funda is also involved in that process. Then you start a process of negotiation with the real estate agents where you place a bid, a counter bid, and you discuss the terms for purchasing or for renting. And eventually you, if all goes well, you decide to buy a house. And buying a house is not the end, because then buying a house also means there's a whole logistic of moving your furniture from A to B. Maybe moving the furniture from a different city to another city. And Funda is also involved in that process. And it doesn't even end there. You have bought a house, you have lived there for 10 years, and now you want to move to a bigger house because you are expecting kids, or maybe you have kids who want bigger bedrooms. And then the cycle follows, and you're back on the orientation. So based on this, we had teams that would focus on these bits of customer journey. We have a team called Search and Find that solely focuses on empowering the users to search the right houses. Insights, which really gives you information about neighborhoods, which could be anything from how close is it to your office, to what are the amenities, so on and so forth, to help you decide on neighborhoods, and also the house itself, the condition of the house, how old is the house, who are the previous owners, so on and so forth. And there is an entire team that focuses on real estate agents called team agents, and they look at what it means for real estate agents to continue being a part of Funda. What does that mean? And what values can be added to real estate agents? In all of this, there also was a team called Team Apps, which is a very nice team. Which was a very nice team, and that's the spoiler. And this team would only focus on bringing features to life on mobile apps, on iOS, on Android. Yet, I think it was inherently an anti-pattern, because decisions on what features we want to bring to life to help people search, or what insights we want to give to the people who want to buy, or what values we want to add to the real estate agents. These decisions were made by the team in which Team Apps was not involved. So Team Apps always got a story in their backlog, which was to build something that is already being built or has been built on the website. So this was a clear anti-pattern, which led to a very large parity gap, and it also made the development of features very inefficient. What's parity gap? Parity gap is when platforms provide different services. So if you go to, for example, Amazon.com, then all the things that you can do on the browser, you can also do on their mobile app. That is a good example of not having a parity gap. If you go to Facebook, you probably have even more features on the native apps than on the website. They do have a parity gap, but it's a company's vision to deliver feature mainly to the mobile apps. On Funda, there were a lot of features, a lot of services, which were primarily available on the website, but not on the mobile apps. And this is a problem that we wanted to address, because the users on the mobile apps are serious users, as we like to segment them. And what does that mean? The users on the mobile apps turned out to be most likely to purchase a house. So they were a lot more serious than the website. We still don't know why, but this is an observation which we have made. So there was a breeding necessity to bring features to life, which would really work on the parity gap side of things. And the second bit was inefficiency. When you're building a feature, then you really don't want an API to be built which only works for the web application, but you want the API to be built so that it can also be used on iOS and Android. And since the features were solely built on the website by the feature teams, at the time when we wanted on the mobile apps, we had to kind of rework the implementation on the API, which just made everything inefficient. So we came up with a hypothesis. I came up with the hypothesis and I pitched it to the management. And I said, like, Flutter is a solution fit for this problem. Flutter will enable us to close the parity gap between web and app. And it will also enable us to increase the efficiency of development of features. And the management was like, oh my God, that's so cool. We totally agree with you, but how would you prove it to me? And I cannot just say like, hey, you have to trust me and it's gonna work. So we had to go back and validate this hypothesis. We really had to say, is it really true that Flutter is going to help us build features efficiently? And is it really true that it will help us close the parity gap? So we set out a process of validating it. The whole process took us about 3 months, a little less than that. And it was a very structured project where we wanted to validate on the efficiency and the performance of the Flutter modules. And we wanted to look at what does it mean for scalability. The solution direction which we take, can we still go with it for multiple features? How scalable is it? To measure efficiency and performance, we decided to rebuild a very key feature in the existing mobile apps in Flutter. It was only a change in code without any change in the UI, meaning the users didn't even know that the stuff they were seeing were built with Dart. And we wanted to measure the quality by really looking at crashes, non-responsive screens, frozen frames, and so on, across the native and Flutter to really say that, okay, it's much better on native as opposed to Flutter. And we wanted to closely monitor the development costs. We follow Jira, which is a product backlog management SaaS. And with Jira, you can very easily find out the amount of time it took to complete tasks. And that kind of reflects on the amount of money that was spent in building a feature. Scalability, yes. Just building a feature on the mobile app with Flutter doesn't mean that Flutter is a good solution fit. Flutter should enable us to build every other feature in future on mobile apps with Flutter. And for that, we had to address scalability to really understand, is it even going to work? Before I get into the validation part, how we validated it, I would like to take a short break and maybe look at some of the questions that have been asked so far.
Yeah, there is one question that has come in. It has come a little early. So it's about, what's your opinion on the need for awareness in Android application development? with these new platform agnostic environments like Flutter, React Native, etc. In particular, for people starting fresh on mobile apps?
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, if you are aspiring to be an Android developer, what does Flutter development mean to you? Is that the question?
If you are looking for to be a Flutter developer and you're exposed to Android application development, what kind of awareness would you need to be a Flutter developer?
Yeah. So as an Android developer, you typically are used to a certain way of things. Like you either choose MVVM or MVI. Let's say you would use architecture components from Google, where you have views that listen for state changes, and you have view models that emit states to the views, and then the view models have the necessary business logic, which you can easily test with unit testing, and you assert on the states that are emitted. And then, of course, you have the models, which are pure ponchos. Flutter is built on that premise. It's built on reactive computing. So that's the fundamentals of Flutter itself. So in that sense, I think that transition from you being an iOS developer who likes Swifty UI or an Android developer who is used to MVI pattern or MVVM pattern with architecture components, the transition is going to be very easy because it's a very well-versed and well-known paradigm. It's also quite comparable to reactive programming. I know Aritha is looking into React Native and React frameworks. It's also quite comparable to that because you're again dealing with futures and streams. So Flutter has a lot of the reactive paradigms that are quite common with front-end development. So does that kind of answer your question?
I think Kumar Raja, he's the one who's asked this question. He rephrased the question again. Okay, question was to know how essential is Android application development experience for someone who has to start fresh with Flutter?
None. You don't need to know any Android app development to start with Flutter. And as a matter of fact, if you take my word, it's better if you don't know Android app development if you start with Flutter, because I've seen Flutter implementation in our company from people who have been Android developers before, and you see that there's a certain comfort zone and a certain way of doing things reflected in code. But right now, most of the Flutter code is actually written by front-end engineers who have previous experience with Vue.js and React.js, like pure JavaScript developers. And it's quite wonderful to see them start with the hello world of Flutter to building a feature from scratch. Yeah.
I guess that answers Rajat.
Yes. So there's nothing that stops you from jumping into Flutter and giving it a shot. It's a very low learning curve. So that's nice. All right. So at this point, I have explained you guys on why we set about Flutter. What is it that we were trying to achieve? And now I'm going to focus a bit more on what exactly did we do to validate. So we went through a very well-known UI within Funda ecosystem. We call it the media viewer. It's the photo viewer. It has about 25, those many million views a month, about 26 million views a month. It's by far the most used view in the mobile apps. It's also relatively heavy on media. We load very, very high resolution images as well for certain houses on certain devices with certain network conditions. And on certain peak hours, we have about 100,000 views per hour. So that made it a good candidate to test Flutter and to really see how it performs at scale. And to do that, we basically built a Flutter module and we integrated it on the native apps. And some of the key takeaways was that it was very few lines of code compared to the similar implementations on Android and also on iOS, as opposed to a single source, which was very nice. It took us a week to build it from scratch and a week more to polish it and roll out through Firebase remote config. We measured the performance, such as ANRs and crashes with Crashlytics from Firebase. And we also measured the performance with frozen frames with Firebase Perf, which is a wonderful library. I would really recommend you guys to try it. And it just worked. We tested it on a very sizable amount of people and no one noticed even the difference between the native and the Flutter implementation because the UI was identical. So people didn't really know that this was happening, which made it a very good success story. And it was quite important for me to make sure that it would work as I wanted it to work with the existing continuous integration and delivery tooling that we use at Funda, which is Azure DevOps, which is also something that just worked. One of the downsides was the increase in the app size. Our APK was about 8 MB, and that went to about 12 MB. So we gained 4 MB in space for a module. Then came the interesting bit about scalability. All right, so I have just rebuilt a part of the app in Flutter. It's a success story. What if I would rebuild every other part of the app in Flutter? Would that even work? What would that even mean? So for that, we had to go back to the drawing board before writing code. And at Funda, this is how we visualize the organization to be. This is actually how the organization structure is now. You have teams who work on epics at a given point of time. They're all working on their own epics at the same given point of time. Team Search and Find is working on improving the filters that are used by the users to filter on various aspects of the houses that we want to search. Team Insights is looking into the insights of the neighborhood where the houses are at, and also they're looking at a feature called Varde check, which is in Dutch, but in English it means it's a valuation tool from Funda. So essentially we have a data science team and they have built models that can predict the value of your house currently in the market. And that value we make it public for people to use, which can give them a good incentive to sell their house. And then we also have team agents who are working on features to be able to search for real estate agents, the real estate agent you want to work with to either buy a house or sell a house, and also some new ways of positioning office spaces of real estate agents through native advertising. So this is typically how it looks. And now, what would it mean if they all were to build Flutter modules, individual Flutter modules, and ship it to the native apps? What would that mean? And that's when we were faced with the reality that in the Flutter inherently has a limitation in the framework where it does not support integration of multiple modules. yet. I think it's key to mention yet, because there is a massive demand from the community. They would really like to have it. It just isn't there. And now it's a matter of when, then if, or why. So this means, what does this mean? It means that if you have 10 modules, 20 modules, independent pieces of code showing a specific UI component in Flutter, you cannot have those 20 modules as 20 separate dependencies through Gradle or through CocoaPods on iOS. And that's simply because iOS and the Android app can only have a single module, which is, they can only take one module, which is, well, it's a bit inconvenient, right? Because you want to work with multiple modules. And one of the main contributors on the Flutter community, who is also the principal engineer at Google for Flutter, he came up with, let's call it a workaround, and it's a package called Flutter Modular. And what Flutter Modular does is it uses it's essentially builds an umbrella which allows you to package any amount of modules you want, as long as each module has been defined with a unique route. So, and what this does is that this helps you to eventually have a single module, which is the Android archive or the XC framework for iOS from Flutter Modular. But underneath, Flutter Modular is a very thin layer which only takes as input a certain route from the native apps, and it allows you to reach a certain module that is tied to that route. So it meant, like, for us, it meant this, where we would have this layer, which is the umbrella, that would sit between the native apps and all the modules that were built by the teams. It was also quite important for us that we didn't have a single repository with all the modules in it. And that's more to do with the bounded context that we really wanted to enforce to the teams. Teams should own their own code. They should own the responsibility of the code they build. And we did not want that to sit on a shared space called Funda Flutter app, for example. So it increases linearly with the number of modules, but not entirely true. It increases and then it flattens at some point. And that happens because the Flutter engine instance that is used by individual modules at some point can be cached, which reduces the app size increase after a certain amount of modules. Integration with CI and CD is not trivial because the Flutter Modular works with path-based dependencies, and CI and CD tooling, as you know, doesn't really like path-based, but it's doable. We have managed to ship 3 modules and we are scheduled with 2 more in the next 2 months, so it's possible. Versioning is possible as long as you have a self-hosted Dart pub server, something that I'm working on now as we speak. I was actually talking about it today morning here at 11. We're getting closer, and once that's there, I'm probably going to blog about that also. That's a very exciting way of essentially having all these little modules in your own ecosystem, and then it becomes a lot easier to import it in CI and CD. And then a very important takeaway was that feature teams then truly became independent and autonomous, and that's very important to us. We really wanted to make sure that teams would be autonomous, they can make decisions themselves, and they become independent. And they can just build the modules themselves. There is a pure API which works for Nuxt modules, also works for Flutter modules, and eventually they also have all the tools to integrate it with the native apps and release the apps through CI and CD. So what does that mean? It's a success story. And I'm also quite happy, like when you are at the beginning of the year talking to management, mustering all your confidence to say that Flutter is the way forward. There's a bit of a guesswork you're doing that maybe it's going to work. And after 3 months, it really felt good to see that it does indeed work. And it's a great use case. But it was also a time when we realized that I started talking about it within Netherlands, in the tech community within Netherlands. And then we very soon discovered that there are a lot of very big banks in Netherlands and also the biggest online e-commerce platforms with some of the biggest and best known mobile apps. They are all moving to Flutter. So it feels like we're on the right track, which meant it also became a talking point of the mobile strategy at Funda and helped us to make decisions on not only the composition of the team, but also on how we build features, like really streamlining the process. Before I give a small sneak peek into what's next, I would like to, again, maybe check back with Priyank and see if there are any questions.
There was one message by Mr. Ramesh Phatak. I think he posted a question on the Q&A window, but it didn't really appear there. So if you're listening to us now, Mr. Ramesh, you can type it in the chat window. Yeah, there he goes. He just sent the question, Rajat. So
Yes.
the question is, using Flutter, how to handle two things. Number one, interfaces to device assets like camera, mic, sensors. And number two, upgrades to native OS like Android, iOS, or Windows.
That is a very nice question. By the way, I'm very happy that someone asked that question. Yeah, so a Flutter module by itself means nothing. It's on itself, it doesn't mean much. A Flutter module only makes sense with the native apps containing it. If you build a Flutter app from scratch, a Hello World Flutter app, then you're going to get a folder structure which is going to have the Dart code in it. But that bit of UI component which you see, you can see it either on Android or on iOS or on Chrome. But you cannot decouple the two words. So it is important. It's very important to keep this in mind that those two words always work together. If you would like to build a feature where you will have to use the accelerometer, for example, or open up the camera, that's when the module needs to make a hop to the native SDK, the native APIs. In the case of iOS, you would try to open up the camera, and the camera API from the iOS SDK requires a certain set of permissions, and only if that's given, then you get to open. You don't want that code in Flutter, and that's why they have built message channels. And what message channels essentially are, they are the message queues between a Flutter module and the native app. And they work based on contracts. So a Flutter module can call a function on native code, and the native application can also call a function inside a Flutter module. Those two worlds can know each other. And for that, you would use a framework called Pigeon. It's easy to remember. It's a bird that passes messages. You cannot miss it. And Pigeon makes this communication type safe. So that Does that answer your question, Ramesh? Maybe, Priyank?
Rajat, did you also touch upon the upgrades to native OS?
Yeah, so upgrade to native OS is something that you don't really have to worry about as long as you have a clear separation of concern on what should be on the platform and what should be on the feature. Let's take an example. So you're on Funda and you would like to build a feature where when people visit the house, they would like to take photos of the house they're visiting and save it on their private cloud, something as simple as that. And they want to do that on their mobile apps. When you do this, then the Flutter module, which is like a view that is presented on your iPhone or your Android, it kind of needs to interact with the native APIs, in this case, the native iOS camera API or the Android camera API, which is going to open up the camera and it's going to show the picture. You take a picture and it saves it to the cloud, so on and so forth. Now, meanwhile, maybe there's a new version of iOS that you need to upgrade to, and maybe there's a new version of Android that you need to move to. The module doesn't care what version you are on. It really doesn't care, because the whole handling of permissions, which is typically what is happening in the last 4 generation of iOS updates and Android updates, is like more permissions before you get to use hardware, is still handled on the native app. So you do not have to worry about it. Meaning, if you are building a Flutter application, you have to take into consideration some topics that just don't make sense for Flutter, but needs to exist on the native side. And it's fine. And it's fine. Like, my advice would be don't fight it, just work with it. Some things which are native, it makes sense if you have them native. And some things which are non-native, if you can build it in Flutter. Clear?
Ramesh, thanks you for the answers, Rajat.
You're welcome.
Okay, so another question. Has there been a situation where Flutter applications have to interact with Android apps? Inter-process communication, maybe?
Yes, so quite a lot. So at Funda, I can give very concrete examples and how we do it. Maybe that helps. At Funda, you can create an account. You can create an account as a user to become a user of Funda, the platform. And with that, you get a lot of features. Like you get notified if there's a new house, you get notified if there is a change in the valuation of your house, so on and so forth. For authorization and authentication, we use authorization. Yeah, we use authorization with authorization code flow. There are different flavors of authorization. We use PKCE with authorization code flow. Now, that's typically something which is Swift code on iOS and Kotlin on Android, because we did not want to implement authorization for every module that we build, because then upgrading from authorization code to authorization code and PKC with OpenID Connect is going to be a nightmare. And then comes the question, like, how do the modules know if the user is logged in? How do the modules know if the logged in user has the correct, settings to be able to see the information? And that's where we use, inter-process communications. In this case, it's called message channels. That is your inter-process communication. And with message channels, the Flutter modules ask a specific question and get an answer from the native side, and vice versa. And that happens through by passing along type-safe objects or basic types like strings and integers. Does that answer the question?
I think there are no other questions, Rajat, so
All right.
we can move.
Yes. So Flutter became a strategic topic, which is always nice. And it took maybe 2 months. And within a span of 2 months, we had Team Search and Find, Insights, and Agents, all of them having their own Flutter engineers in the team, building the features for the website and for the native apps in parallel, in the same sprint, as part of the same epic. And that kind of made it really, that was a proof that it was a success story. We even built an entire component with Flutter. I'm going to show you guys. This is the detail page of a house that you typically look at. And when you actually go to look at the neighborhood itself, then you see all the information about the neighborhood, such as what is the average price, what's the typical time to sell, and so on and so forth. And everything here is built on Flutter. It's built by Team Insights, and it's in their own repository. It's not even in the iOS or Android repository. This is a good example of autonomous features which are built by the teams and brought to life in native apps. And the second feature is Check, which I mentioned about. This is where we were, this is a service with which you can actually find the price of your house. Like we have a whole process of telling you, is your house, what's the price of your current house? And you got to create an account. This is again interesting because this had a very different flavor of integration. With the previous one, as you guys saw, we would just open up a separate view, a Flutter module. But this is a Flutter module which is embedded within the app. It's actually one of the view controllers within the tab bar on iOS. And that made it quite interesting to build. And yeah, there's a lot of communication that is happening with native. To use this feature, first of all, you have to be logged in. The fact that you're seeing this screen is because you're logged in. So in some way, the module needs to know if you're logged in or not, and that's where we use the inter-process communications. And we are in the process of building an entire page for real estate agents, where you can look at the real estate agents who are in your neighborhood and have a whole functionality to search for real estate agents, get in touch with them, provide reviews, so on and so forth. And the good news is we are only getting started. So it's a very exciting time to be. And that also concludes my presentation.
Rajat, so we have a couple more questions.
Yes.
And I'll open up the Q&A window first. So there's a question by Joel. Flutter is great and have a lot of strengths, but have you found any shortcomings of Flutter? And if so, how did you overcome them?
A shortcoming of Flutter so far has been that there's quite a lot of jank on iOS, especially on older iOS devices. And that's where you have to be really careful with how you lay out the widgets on Flutter. You got to make sure they're const. You got to be very careful with the redrawing side of things. The other shortcoming of Flutter, so that's not very trivial. You would expect like, okay, I just wrote code, it works everywhere. It doesn't. So that's the classic story of cross-platform development. And it's a lot closer to Android than iOS. I've seen it in the sense that a lot of the Flutter UI APIs just work as you would expect them to work on Android, but not so on iOS. And that's a bit frustrating, of course, because I mean, the whole point was to build something that works on both Android and iOS. How did I overcome? most of the problems I had on Flutter is by really going back to the community. Flutter has a very active and very friendly, which is also important, active and friendly and very knowledgeable community of developers on GitHub. It's really big and it's very nice and they're very helpful and responsive. And often I have seen open issues on GitHub and there's really nothing stopping you from taking the step, creating a pull request, proposing a solution, and chances are quite high that they're going to get approved and you're going to improve the framework along the way. So that has also been the place for me to really get answers to rather complex questions. Having said that, I haven't really run into anything that is an absolute blocker so far, fingers crossed. And I would say in terms of the UI, it's the age-old, is it as good as native UI? I really think it is. It's really hard to find the difference between a native UI and a non-native, in this case, a Flutter UI. Even so that we tested on real users, about 20,000 users on iOS and 50,000 on iOS, and none of them could find out that it was different. So in that sense, I think it's really, really nice. Having said that, it's important before you decide upon building a Flutter app to really get an idea about what you're trying to build. If you're trying to build an application like TikTok, or if you're trying to build AR capabilities on top of a video chatting application, then maybe Flutter is not the way forward, because then you are essentially doing most of the work on the native side. Then I would say just go all in native. But if you're relying on the native for very basic things like authorization, authentication, maybe some few hardware APIs, then there really shouldn't be anything stopping you from using Flutter.
Rajat, I think you answered. There's one more question which was kind of related. I think you answered that also, but I'll just read it out if you want to add a few more stuff. What are the cons of Flutter over native development? If there are cons, then what are the solutions for it?
Yeah, one known con, and that's a bit more like impactful for business, is Flutter 2.0 was live March this year. So that was kind of a big deal, because the reason was Flutter 2.0, Flutter for web was stable, meaning the piece of code which you would write, it would also work on all browsers, which is fantastic. But it works, yet they don't have server-side rendering for the pages, meaning when you do load the pages, there's going to be a delay, and that's not very good for search engine optimization, for example. So that's kind of, it still kind of makes it like this thing which works on iOS and Android. Having said that, they are also in pre-alpha stages for server-side rendering on Flutter, and there's a chance that it might become a thing next year. And when that happens, then you really have a very strong and formidable player in the market for building applications, front-end applications. The second and maybe the final con about Flutter is it's new. And new is not good, not always good. And it's very new, very young. It's also, Dart is also a very young programming language. Another fear factor I have is it's from Google. So you never know when they're going to say, okay, bye-bye, we're going to go with something else. But they did mention, Google, that they have chosen Dart for a lot of applications that are going to be available on Fuchsia, the operating system which they're working on. And if you look at the accounts page, accounts.google.com, it's built on Flutter, and Google Pay is built on Flutter. Parts of Google Play Store is built on Flutter. So there is more and more key components which are built on Flutter. So the problem with having something very new is like if you're really stuck on a certain problem, then there's no clear answer to it. And talent acquisition can be a challenge for companies because there just aren't enough Flutter engineers. And to me personally, the biggest problem is if you are working with a young ecosystem, young framework, then there are no standards on architecture. Like what you can have the entire application in a single file on Flutter. There's no one stopping you from that. You can have everything on main.dart, but obviously you don't want that. So then comes the question of, okay, what is a good architectural choice? And those things are standardizing slowly. We're getting there, but it's not there yet. I mean, if you compare it to Java or C#, it's not there yet. Yeah, does that answer?
So there are a couple more questions, but then
Yes.
we are also hitting the time limit. So what we can do is those who want to drop off because it's the end of the scheduled time, please feel free. We will have these conversations continue. We don't want this conversation to stop today at 7 o'clock. We would like you to get involved and get engaged with us. You can follow our LinkedIn page. You can go subscribe our YouTube channel where there are furthermore videos on recordings, video recordings on various different topics are posted. And if you have questions on this particular topic, you tried something on your own and then you wanted help, you can always feel free to reach out to us. We will find ways to get you connected with Rajat if that would be helpful. And we want this community to grow, so why not? And if you want to stay back and listen to the couple more questions that are coming in, please do stay back. Rajat, is there a
Of
different way
course.
of getting connected with you, or would you prefer?
I can stay back if you. It's not like I have to run somewhere. So I really like the questions so far, and I can answer some more if that
Yeah,
helps.
sure. And later, let's say after a couple of days, somebody tried something and then wanted to come back to you and seek your opinion. Is there a blog where you can be reached out to?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for reminding. So of course, like I try to document most of the things, interesting things on LinkedIn. So please feel free to connect there.
Okay.
That's one place, of course. And I also have blogged um, about the validation that we did with Flutter. So maybe it's interesting that I place it here. And
In the chat window?
yes, but
Yeah.
go. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
There you go.
that's a blog which please read and share. It would make everyone happy. Um,
There are a couple
yeah.
of
So
questions.
those are kind of the two places I would say. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. So there are a couple more questions we can take. One from Matthias. He says, you can be the one to create patterns, architecture, and new components based on the fundamentals and common practices of software engineering. Maybe he's giving you some cues on where to focus.
Yes, because he's my colleague,
Okay.
and that's true. So I agree. So I agree with Mateus.
There's
And
one
we are
question.
actually, it's interesting you mentioned it because I feel like I should also, I'm just gonna, yeah, it's a bit of a freestyle, I would say. But what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna put in here another chat. So this particular repository on GitHub is a place, it's called Block, which follows the MVVM, MVI pattern that is known for front-end development. And that's becoming more or less the new agreed upon standard architecture pattern for building Flutter applications. And it's really big and it's becoming more or less the standard in the industry. So if you are planning on building Flutter for your clients or for your own interest or for Aritha itself internally, I would say my advice would be to use Block, and it's a very well-known, clean software architecture. It uses very clean architecture patterns, so you can just use that. And it's also a great way to learn about streams and futures. So I just posted that link there. For those who are watching it later, yeah, I hope we can also share it in some other medium.
Yeah, of course. So there was one more question which I had kind of parked because it was related to one of the earlier questions. So remember there was a question about interaction between Android apps and the Flutter designed app. So was there a possibility of navigating in UI for the apps interaction, for example, Flutter UI and then Android UI and then back to Flutter UI?
Yes, it's possible. It is totally possible to do that. Is it maybe an idea that I very quickly, I won't take too much time, but very quickly shared the architecture diagram for message channels. I think that will answer, because there have been like multiple questions on that, on how the two worlds talk to each other. And I can just show it to you guys. And probably that will also answer this very specific question which you mentioned. What do you think, Priyan? Could that work?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
All right. So this is from the Flutter documentation page itself. And essentially, this is how platform channels work. This is the IPC that I was talking about, where you can have messages, which could be models, essentially, which are passed from client UI, which is the host platform, to the module. So if you really look at broadly at a Flutter app essentially requires a host app, which is the iOS and the Android app. So as I said, those two worlds need to work with each other. They don't mean anything separately or individually. And what the Flutter app does is it kind of gets using the method channels, which is provided by the framework. With the message channels, the iOS app can interact with the Flutter app and vice versa. And they can also open up views on iOS, and the iOS app can also open up views on Flutter, and so on and so forth. A good example would be when we built the feature for house valuation in mobile apps, then we embed the Flutter module within the apps. So it doesn't open it out separately, but it's within the app. And for that, there was a lot of back and forth between native and the Flutter modules. So the Flutter module would say, hey, show me embedded, hey, show me full screen. And the native app would then show things in a different way, which is very pure native implementation. And that's indeed like the whole point of having method channels, that those two worlds need to talk to each other, and that's fine, and they can talk to each other. You can have contracts between these two models as essentially with a set of Dart values, but I would always recommend to really use Pigeon, which is a wonderful framework, because that allows you to have messages that are type safe. So you're building objects. You're saying like, this will be class user with logged in access tokens, so on and so forth, which you pass along from A to B. Yeah, so I hope that gives a bit more insight on how those two worlds can talk to each other, and it's actually being taken care of. Yeah, you're welcome, Kumar Raja. Like, please read through. And another thing which I think is worth mentioning is Flutter as excellent documentation, as opposed to a lot of new other frameworks I've tried where it's terrible. It's really well documented. So they have a lot of really nice, documentation on these aspects.
All right. Thank you, Rajat. This was very insightful. I'm sure the participants would have learned a lot, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more people who will be listening to this recording later point in time. For various reasons, they couldn't make it on time today. So this recording will be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. We just have to do some, video editings, and then we'll be on. So thank you for taking time, Rajat, on a working day, and it is, we know that it's still your working hours. In India it's mostly close of office hours, but you're still working. So thank you for taking time on Thursday, and look forward to having you all in future webinars and continued engagement.
Thank you very much for this, Priyank. It was really nice. And I hope Aritha also becomes one of the early adopters for Flutter in the real future.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.